Hi and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to tackle one of the most critical parts of any WRX. Sorry for the suspenseful opening. If you've ever spoken to me about building or buying a WRX, whether it be for road or rally use, then the first thing in our discussion would have been the fuel system. And that's exactly what I'm going to cover today. So it's likely that you already know that the fuel tank and fuel pump are in the back of WRXs or Subarus. What you may not know is how the fuel system works on the engine, and that's where the critical part begins. Basically, the fuel comes in up here, it actually swings around the back of the engine and comes around to this first injector on the first cylinder here, then it hits the second injector in the cylinder here, and then it follows a pipe that travels under the manifold to hit this side here, for the fuel injector on this side here, and then finally it hits the last fuel injector, which is down under there. Not very easy to see. Now, because it travels such a long way and then all round the engine, it is prone to fuel problems, particularly fuel pressure. And that's why it's so critical, because if the fuel pressure leans out on these turbocharged engines, particularly these boxer engines, what happens is they start melting pistons and or rings. And it's very common for fuel pressure problems to result in blown engines. So that's why fuel systems are so critical on these motors. Also, the fuel pressure regulator, before it returns to the tank, is here, right at the back of the engine. And so we've got to do a few things just to make sure that these systems stay reliable. So let's start with the fuel tank. Now this normally sits below the back seat, and it's actually shaped to fit around the back seat there. And it's actually called a saddle tank because we've got two sort of separate halves to the tank that are joined by a very thin section in the middle. And there's a little bit of plumbing in there behind the scenes to help out with the fuel transfer in that. Effectively, it's this shape so that it gets the weight down low inside the car, keeps the center of gravity down. And also this opening here is where the tail shaft and the exhaust pass through underneath, where it's under the car to keep everything tucked up and out of the way. So from a weight perspective, it was actually a good design. One of the major factors with these tanks is the way the fuel transfers from side to side, and it's better than some other cars, things like the old Mazda 323s. They actually had an electric pump that used to transfer fuel from one side of the tank to the other, whereas at least this relies on a passive system, so the fuel does transfer. However, the pump is mounted on the right side of the tank, and there's a pickup and a sensor on the left side that also feeds with the fuel level sensor on this side. So there's a fair bit of mucking around at the back here. It also means you've got to be very, very careful when you're drilling holes in the floor around the back seat area, because it is very easy to drill straight through the floor pan and into the fuel tank, which is right up underneath the floor. Just a word of warning, be very, very careful, and if you are doing any work in the back of these cars, not to drill through. I have seen cases where people have drilled holes through the floor to mount stereo wiring speakers and things like that, amplifiers, and they've drilled straight through the fuel tank. It's not an easy job to get these fuel tanks out. Basically, it's rear diff out, or whole rear cradle and rear diff out of the car, plus tail shaft and exhaust, to actually get at the fuel tank to replace it. Now this particular tank, when I cleaned it, you probably saw, has got a Kevlar carbon fibre reinforcing skin that has been put over the tank. This came out of a rally car, a different rally car actually, but it came out of a rally car, and that is why I'm looking at using this tank, and I've gone to all the effort of cleaning it up. However, I have noticed on this side here, it has got a bit of damage under here, so I'm going to take that hatch off and have a look and see to make sure the tank's not badly damaged inside. It's probably taken a couple of litres of volume out of the tank. And these tanks are not really a very big tank to begin with. They're about 50 litres, I think 45 or 50 litres. They're not huge tanks. And so when you're rallying them, it proves to have as much fuel volume in there as you can. Let's get the fuel pump side off and have a look in here, because that's the next most critical part of this work. Now, if you're removing the fuel hatch cover in the car, because you can change the pumps in these in situ in the car, they're not too bad a job. A lot of dirt and dust tends to collect around the top of this. The hatch is quite bad for that. So the trick there is to get a vacuum cleaner and a brush and brush it all out and vacuum it all out to get all that dust out first before you try and undo these bolts and take that tank hatch out, because the last thing you want to do is have any of that dust and dirt fall down inside the fuel tank. That just creates a whole bunch more problems. Also, these little nuts, they're a little 8mm nut. They're an M4 or M5, I think. Be very careful with these, because if you drop one of these down inside the tank or even around the opening and it falls down onto the fuel tank, then you're in a whole world of pain to try and get more of these nuts. They're not easy to get hold of. Now, if this has come out of a rally car, I should expect to find a good quality fuel pump in there, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. However, this tank has been out of the car for a very long time and it's been in storage, so there's a good chance the fuel pump in it could be in a bad state or could have corroded inside there. I also don't know what the inside of the tank's like yet, so I want to get inside there and have a look. And as irony would have it, there's actually no fuel pump in here at all. This hatch, however, may not be the hatch that was for this tank. This tank may have been purchased without a hatch on it. So that is good to know, that I didn't just put that in the car and try and hook that up and then have problems. Looking at this must have had a standard fuel pump on it, I'm guessing, because the wiring changes when you go to a different type of pump. It's not too bad in there. Just get some of the old residue out of there that's been laying around in the bottom of there for a while where the fuel's all evaporated. Just give it a bit of a clean up inside there. Let's have a look in this side and see what we can find. Okay, with special tool 2153, I'm going to get in there and try and clean out some of this nastiness from inside the tank. Yeah, that's what's hanging around inside the tank. Okay, let's get on to the next critical bit in the fuel tank system, and that is the fuel pump. Now, it's probably not that easy to see here. You might be able to just see in there it says made in USA. This is a Walbro fuel pump. What we do is, with all road and rally cars that we build, a Walbro fuel pump goes in the tank irrespective of what it's being used for. One of the best ways to combat the fuel pressure problems these things suffer is to use a decent fuel pump. These are a 255 litre per hour pump or thereabouts, high pressure race pump. There's quite a few things that set these apart from a standard pump. The big one is inside these pumps there's metal gears in there rather than plastic gears, which does make them noisier. They have a distinct whine to them. However, that makes them a lot more reliable and they're good. Now, one thing to be wary of with this, and it caught me out last year, was I buy my Walbro pumps online, and last year I found a seller on eBay that was advertising genuine Walbro fuel pumps, and they were a bit cheaper. There wasn't a lot in it, but they were a bit cheaper than what I'd been buying them for previously, and so I ordered a fuel pump from that supplier. It was put into the tank of one of our rally cars, and that pump failed on its first use. Basically what happened was, luckily it was idle, but the car just cut out and still had half a tank of fuel, and the pump just stopped working, and it was idling in service. So when we pulled the pump out and investigated, we realised that we'd actually bought a counterfeit pump. I'll put a photo of what the counterfeit pump looked like up here. There's quite a few websites that you can go on to tell how they're counterfeit pumps. There's a few ways to identify them. But probably the most significant one now is that they've actually changed. This was the box from the replacement fuel pump that went into that rally car. It is now they've changed to TI Automotive, so Walbro are now called TI Automotive, and this is a genuine pump. I actually rang the supplier when I got this box to verify this, and they said, yep, that's it now. They've changed the name. So from now on, if you buy a fuel pump that's got Walbro branding on it, it's most likely a counterfeit pump. One of the easy ways, and one of the ways that we discovered that we'd had was when we pulled the fuel sock off and looked at the gears inside the pump, which we didn't do beforehand because we thought it was a genuine pump. The gears inside the counterfeit pump were plastic. So if you buy a fuel pump online, before you put the pump together or whatever, they just come as just the cylinder. Have a look inside the inlet side of it, and if you can see plastic gears in there, then it is definitely not a genuine Walbro or TI pump. It is a counterfeit fake. The good news is I managed to get my money back. The bad news is it took me 3 months to get my money back on that, because whilst they were an Australian seller, they weren't in WA, and it had to go through eBay to get that sorted out, and it took a bit of time, and in the end it cost me freight to send the old pump back to the supplier or the seller. So just be wary of that. If you are buying them online, buy them from a reputable website rather than buying them off eBay. Now, I'm sorry to those people on eBay who actually do sell genuine pumps, but you just need to be wary because this was falsely advertised as a genuine Walbro pump with a 12-month warranty, and that was none of the above. Now, also when you generally when you order these pumps, and what we do is we order them with a fitting kit for a WRX. This pump hasn't actually got the WRX fitting kit on it. This fuel sock's a little bit small and a little bit on the wrong angle for what I would like. Normally in a rally car, the sock is slightly larger and it's got slightly more of an angle, so it sits inside the in-tank swell pot. However, again, for what we're using this for, it'd be perfectly fine, and it was rallied like this. The other trick with these WRXs is to keep the fuel tank full. Basically, when you're rallying them, just run with a full tank. When you're competing with them in anything, full tank all the time. Not so important in road cars. The reason being is the fuel tank design inside, they don't have a brilliant swirl pot inside there. They've got a little pan that's spot welded inside there that these pumps sit inside that's supposed to stop fuel surge. It's not brilliant. It is better than some other cars, but it's not a brilliant setup. So the more fuel you keep in the tank, the less chance there is of getting fuel surge in them. So we just run them full. Also, if you keep the tank level full or fairly full most of the time, if the car sits for a while, the air doesn't get into the pump to oxidize the pump and create problems inside there with gears and whatever. Now, I would have ordinarily put a brand new pump and fitting kit into this before I put it in the car. However, I don't have one in stock, and at the moment with the way freight is, it's going to be weeks and weeks because of this whole pandemic situation. So for some reason, this was all removed out of the fuel fittings out of the old car. So I'm going to put it all back together the way it should go. Don't be scared of using any sort of oil-based or mineral-based lubricant inside there, as in like these fittings are a little bit dry, so I will use some penetrine type stuff on that, and it'll all be fine. So on the bottom there's a rubber foot. Make sure that rubber foot goes on. It then's just a matter of putting it onto the hose. If you buy the WRX fitting kit, it comes with the wiring harness that plugs in from the pump, because these are different to the factory pump. So it plugs in from the Walbro pump to the actual wiring loom, or the plug I should say, on the Subaru. The trick is to make sure that that is plugged in tightly and correctly. Don't want to have to pull this out of the tank again. These should also have a foam sock around them. For some reason this one doesn't have the foam sock on it. I will still put a cable tie around there to anchor that in place and just make sure that doesn't come adrift. that is the fuel tank plumbing done. Now what I will do with this also is this pump will stay in the tank for the time being. I will fuel pressure test it once it all goes together and got the system ready to go, so I can make sure that that pump is going to provide enough pressure, at least in the beginning, and I think we'll probably replace that pump with a new one at some time in the near future anyway, just to be on the safe side. Off camera, I managed to get the fuel lines sorted out into this car, which is fantastic news. The actual fuel lines that had come out of this shell originally went back in, no problem at all, which was great news. One less hassle to worry about. Another piece of the puzzle, the fuel filter. Now the actual standard fuel filter design is not too bad on this either. They actually work quite well. The trick, like anything else, is to keep them well serviced and replace them as necessary. They do, however, provide enough flow and pressure, and as long as they aren't restricted, they work just fine. A couple more pieces to the fuel puzzle on these motors. One is the injectors. These injectors are a side feed injector. And they are a bit prone to getting clogged up, particularly if the car has, or the engine's been sitting for a long period of time, say out in the weather or something as well, and then they don't operate properly. So the trick with these is to take the fuel injectors out and get them ultrasonically cleaned, and then they'll work perfectly well and won't have any problems with fuel leaning out. Now I won't actually pull the injectors out of this just yet. It'll be one of the last things that we do, probably after we've got it all fired up in the car and make sure that everything runs, and then we'll get around to taking those out. The final piece of the puzzle is the fuel pressure regulator. I talked about this a little bit earlier on. The actual regulators themselves are pretty good. They work quite reliably. The really only solution to this, if you wanted to increase the fuel pressure, is to do away with this regulator and go to an aftermarket one that's mounted somewhere else in the engine bay. However, the issue with these is actually more to do with the plumbing rather than the actual regulator. On some of the Subarus, they have an off-take off the manifold here, which off the last cylinder, that provides the vacuum for the fuel pressure regulator. Now, having that vacuum of just one cylinder isn't necessarily the best idea, and so one of the tricks that we do is to replumb these lines and use a pipe that comes up to the center of the manifold where we can get even vacuum off all of the cylinders rather than just off one, and that very small modification can make a big difference to the fuel pressure. So again, didn't quite get everything wanted to get done. Wanted to get the fuel tank in the car. Unfortunately, when I was putting it together, discovered that there's a split in the filler hose between the tank and the filler neck, and that's quite a critical hose. I don't have a spare one of those, so I'll have to hunt one of those down. It just is what it is. It's just another little hurdle to have to overcome. Hopefully it's been informative and you've enjoyed this episode on the Subaru fuel system. Just remember, it doesn't matter whether it's a road car or a rally car, the standard system's pretty good. Really, the Achilles heel is the fuel pump, so a decent fuel pump, and fuel filters, and perhaps the injectors if they need cleaning. With those sort of three major things done, the system should be pretty reliable. And then if you are rallying the car, a fuel pump once every season or 2 seasons makes a big difference as well, because the vibrations can shock those pumps and they can suffer some damage inside, performance or otherwise. Also, if the fuel tank takes a hard knock on the right-hand side, then that can also shock load the pump and may require the pump to be replaced. But if it damages the tank, you may need to replace a tank anyway. All right, thanks very much for watching on this episode. Please give us a thumbs up, like and subscribe, and I'll catch you again on the next episode. Cheers.